What if I told you to forget everything you learned in school about Greek mythology? I know. It's hard to believe when you see the same stories being told over and over in movies and books, labeled as Greek mythology. But what are the odds that you learned a version of these legends that you thought were true, but they're actually not even Greek mythology at all? Now, where were we? Oh, yeah. It started all the way back in the Bronze Age, in ancient Greece, where Greek history was originally passed on exclusively by word of mouth. For generations, can you imagine not being able to write or record anything? I mean, imagine if a United States president was elected and the only information you had about it was a story that your aunt heard from her husband, who heard it from the cashier at the grocery store, who heard it from his roommate, who heard it from her doctor. At some point, details are bound to be dropped and misunderstood, and by the end of the chain, do you even know who won anymore? Due to the fact that technology hadn't advanced far enough at the time, it's not possible to trace the way these myths really gradually unfolded in Greece. But they did continue to develop plots and themes via written literature during the archaic and classical periods of the ancient Mediterranean world, which is where most of what we know today comes from. So, that was the first obstacle when it comes to really understanding if you've got Greek mythology down. The second, making sure you haven't confused it with its similar counterpart, Roman mythology. One of the most common mistakes when I hear about Greek mythology is that people will use an entirely Roman interpretation of a myth by mistake and describe it as Greek. Many of the attempts at Greek mythology you see in Western pop culture are guilty of this. For example, the commonly told story of Medusa as a cursed former priestess of Athena was actually created by the Roman poet Ovid in his work Metamorphosis, where her name isn't even Athena, it's Minerva. And in the original Greek myth written by Hesiod, Medusa and her sisters were already born monsters. If you've ever watched a Medusa movie or heard someone tell her story off the top of their head, it doesn't ever start with her as a monster, it's usually some curse or transformation that she goes through, which is Roman. We made an entire video breaking that story down for you. We'll leave the link in the description so you can check it out after this video. Anyways, in order for you to really understand the differences and similarities between Greek and Roman mythology, I'll break it down into 3 categories: the origins of the myths, the associations and attributes of the mythological figures, and the names and roles of mythological figures. If you remember my spiel about the origins of Greek mythology from a few minutes ago, you know that it started as a word-of-mouth tradition and eventually was formalized by poets and philosophers, such as Hesiod and Homer. How in the world did the same myths end up in Rome? It all happened during the time of Rome's infamous rise to power. Greece was previously considered to be the center of civilization, but it shifted to Rome as power and influence fluctuated in the Mediterranean. With this came a massive culture shift, a new wave, if you will. The exact time frame is difficult to judge, but soon after, the previously mentioned Roman poet Ovid reinterpreted the text so that it aligned more with the Roman culture they were idealizing and striving towards. As a result, Greek myths had an emphasis on heroes, while Roman myths had an emphasis on the founding of Rome and the stories of Romulus, Remus, and Aeneas. Greek mythology, which dates back thousands of years, emphasized the importance of human qualities and the development of individual personalities. The Greek gods and goddesses often exhibited human emotions, flaws, and desires, making them relatable to mortals. On the other hand, Roman mythology had a more structured and formal approach. They believed in an afterlife and had a strong focus on the concept of duty and responsibility. Gods were no exception. When I say the name Zeus, an image comes to mind, right? You might be imagining a strong male figure or a type of resilient hero. But when I say the name Jupiter, what comes to mind? Anything? If not, don't worry, it was designed that way. While Greek gods were depicted with human characteristics and traits, Roman gods and goddesses were named after objects and did not possess a gender. Greek gods predated Roman gods, so it was common in Roman mythology for a poet to take a Greek deity and assign it a Roman object that would fit the description of the Greek god. Apollo was the only deity whose name stayed consistent. Both Greeks and Romans referred to Apollo as Phoebus, meaning pure and bright. And while this doesn't have to do with how they present physically, Roman mythology includes a specific set of deities known as the Capitoline Triad that represent the state gods of Rome. These include Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. In Greek mythology, there is no direct equivalent to this specific triad in any story. Okay, there is no way I'm going to get through these without getting mixed up once, but let's get through it together. As we know, Greek gods were named and depicted with human traits, and Roman gods are referred to as the object they represent in Roman society. As you can see, there are, give or take, 16 major gods with both Greek and Roman variations. I'm gonna go down the list to point out any major differences between the two for each god. First, we have Jupiter from Roman mythology, evolved from the Greek Zeus, and they are both widely considered the greatest and most powerful gods in their respective interpretations. Both were considered the god of the sky and thunder, and king to all the other gods. Second, in Greek mythology, Hera was the goddess representing marriage, women, and family. She entered a marriage with her own brother Zeus, claiming the role of queen of the gods, though her union was far from harmonious. In the realm of Roman mythology, Juno was the closest match. She too became the partner of Zeus's equivalent, Jupiter, and remarkably, they persevered in their relationship despite Jupiter's numerous infidelities. Third, ancient Greek god of the sea Poseidon was transformed by the Romans into Neptune, the god of both freshwater and the sea. In artworks, both looked remarkably similar, with long flowing beards, a muscular frame, and a forked spear in one hand. Fourth, unlike his Greek counterpart, Hades, Pluto represents a much more positive outlook on abundance in the afterlife, whereas Hades is often associated exclusively with death and the fear of the afterlife. Fifth, both Greek goddess Athena and Roman goddess Minerva had associations with tactical warfare. However, Roman goddess Minerva also evolved from Etruscan goddess Menvra, a war and weather goddess. Romans also considered Minerva to be wise and worldly, although they did not like her very much due to her involvement in the Trojan War. Sixth, both Ares in Greek mythology and Mars in Roman mythology were gods of war. But while Ares was seen as unpredictable and not very popular, Mars was respected as a brave protector, second only to Jupiter in importance among the Roman gods. Seventh, Apollo stayed mostly the same. He was universally known as the youthful and idealized god of the sun. Eighth, Artemis, Apollo's sister, was known as the goddess of the hunt, chastity, wilderness, childbirth, and vegetation. She was often linked with the moon. In Roman mythology, Artemis was most similar to Diana. However, Diana also had an additional role as the goddess of crossroads. Similar to Artemis, Diana was Apollo's twin sister and the daughter of Zeus and Leto, known as Jupiter and Latona in Rome. Ninth, Greek god Hermes was the messenger to the gods, and an important mediator between the realms of the living and the dead. His Roman equivalent was named Mercury, who was also a messenger, only named after the fastest traveling planet. Both wore winged sandals, winged helmet, and carried a caduceus. 10th, Aphrodite, the famously strikingly beautiful Greek goddess of sexual love and beauty, ruled over marriage. Her Roman counterpart Venus is similar, but also has associations with vegetation and fertility. 11th, Greek god Hephaestus and Roman god Vulcan were both gods of fire and blacksmithing. 12th, Demeter was the Greek goddess of harvest and grains, and Greeks believed she was responsible for keeping their crops alive. With her daughter Persephone, they were associated with the underworld and the rites of the dead. While Roman, Ceres was also a goddess of grains. Romans also associated her with art and culture. 13th, both of these gods were of wine and grape harvest. However, while Dionysus was seen as a respectful, jovial young man, Bacchus was a debauched partier, whom Romans often depicted as a drunken man. The Roman cult of Bacchus sometimes portrayed him as a vengeful man who punished those who dared to oppose his indulgent ways. 14th, the Greek goddess of the hearth was Hestia. Her Roman equivalent was Vesta, also the goddess of hearth. Hestia and Vesta played an important role as protectors of the family, were modest and innocent, and were associated with the hearth and fire. After listing everything out, do you understand why it might be easy for members of society to get confused or say a wrong name every once in a while? Over years and years, Greek mythology evolved, first into Roman mythology, and now the combination that we reference in pop culture. Overall, Greek mythology has had the larger influence on Western literature, art, and culture, but by no means does that make Rome irrelevant. Later in history, held together by the military power of one city, the Roman Empire grew large enough to cover all of the Mediterranean countries: Spain, Gaul, Northern Africa, Western Asia, and Southern Britain. The Roman ideology made its way around the continents, eventually influencing the developing societies and nations. These ideologies still impact our society today after generations of variation. So, while Greek mythology might seem glamorous because it's the version that Hollywood picked up, it's actually only one version within a long chain of evolution that not only affects movies and art, but society too. Don't forget to find our video on Medusa. Her story is one of the most heavily affected by the difference in Roman and Greek mythology, and it's a super interesting watch, especially while it's fresh on your mind.